My name is Serena Mitchell. I'm 29 years old. I teach second grade, and I'm a single mom to a 6-year-old girl named Lily. And if you saw us a year ago, you would have probably said we were doing okay. Not great, but okay. The kind of okay where you're always one bill away from stress, but still managing to keep things together. We lived in a small, one-bedroom apartment on Division Street. Nothing fancy. Thin walls, old carpet, a heater that made too much noise in the winter, but it was ours. And more importantly, it was close to Lily's school, which meant I could drop her off in the morning, get to work on time, and still pick her up before aftercare fees kicked in. And that mattered because every dollar had a job, every dollar had a purpose, and none of them had room for mistakes. My day usually started at 5:30 a.m. Quiet alarm, quick shower, coffee. I never really finished. Then I'd wake Lily up, help her get dressed, braid her hair at the kitchen table, while she told me about whatever she dreamed the night before. Sometimes it was about animals, sometimes it was about houses she loved, drawing houses always bigger than anything we could afford with yards, and trees and windows that let in a lot of light, and I'd smile and say, "That's a nice one, baby." Even when I knew we weren't getting anything close to that anytime soon, then we'd head out, I'd drop her off. Go teach a class full of 7-year-olds who came with their own stories and struggles, and I'd keep snacks in my drawer because some of them needed it, and maybe I understood that a little too well. Then after work, pick Lily up, we'd go home, make something simple for dinner, read a book, and repeat the next day. It wasn't easy, but it was stable. And stability was everything to me, especially after my divorce, because when Marcus left, he didn't just leave me, he left responsibilities too. Child support checks that showed up late or didn't show up at all, promises that sounded good on paper but didn't translate into real life. So I learned quickly that if something was going to get done, it was going to be on me, and I accepted that. I didn't complain, I didn't expect help, I just focused on keeping a roof over my daughter's head and food on the table, and for a while that was enough, until one Tuesday afternoon when everything shifted in a way I didn't see coming. I remember it clearly because Tuesdays were Lily's library days. She came home excited, backpack full of picture books, already talking about which one we were going to read first. And I was standing in the kitchen opening a letter I had just picked up from the mailbox, thinking it was probably another bill or some random notice, something routine, something I could deal with later. But it wasn't routine, it was a 30-day notice to vacate. The building had been sold new ownership, all tenants out by February 15th. I read it once, then again, then a third time, like maybe the words would rearrange themselves into something less serious, but they didn't. It was clear, direct, no room for negotiation. I remember holding that paper and feeling this quiet kind of panic. Not loud, not dramatic, just this steady pressure building in my chest, because I knew exactly what this meant. It meant finding a new place in a city where rent had already been too high. It meant deposits I didn't have. It meant a timeline that didn't care whether I was ready or not. And behind me, Lily was sitting at the table spreading out her books, asking me which one first, and I folded the notice, slid it into my folder, and sat down next to her like everything was normal because she didn't need to carry that weight. Not yet. That night after she fell asleep, I sat at the table with a pen and the back of a grocery receipt and started doing the math. First month's rent, last month's rent security deposit, at least $4,000 for anything decent and close enough to her school, and I had $1.100 savings. I checked twice just in case I forgot about some hidden money, but no, that was it. $1.100. And then I thought about Marcus, the bounced check in October, the one before that never came, and I didn't even bother reaching out because I already knew how that conversation would go. So I sat there staring at numbers that didn't work, trying to stretch them, rearrange them, convince them to make sense, but they didn't, and the more I looked at them, the more obvious it became that I was in trouble. Real trouble, not the kind you fix with overtime or cutting back on groceries. This was bigger than that, and for a moment I just sat there in silence listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the kind of silence that comes when you realize you've run out of easy options, and I hated what came next. But I picked up my phone and called my mom, because sometimes you reach a point where you have to ask for help, even if you already know the answer. And as the phone rang, I found myself hoping just a little that this time would be different. That maybe she'd say yes, that maybe she'd surprise me, but deep down I knew better. And still I asked anyway, because when you're looking at losing your home, you don't get to be proud, you just try to survive. I held the phone a little tighter than I needed to and stared at the wall while it rang, already rehearsing what I was going to say, so it didn't sound like I was asking for too much, just something temporary, something reasonable, something any parent would understand. And when my mom finally picked up, her voice had that familiar tone, polite but distant, like I had interrupted something more important, and I said, "Hey Mom, do you have a minute?" And she sighed softly before saying, "Make it quick. I'm in the middle of something," which honestly should have been my first clue to hang up, but I didn't because I needed help. So I explained the situation, told her about the eviction, noticed the timeline, how Lily and I just needed a place to stay for a few weeks while I figured things out. Nothing long-term, nothing complicated, just a room. And there was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that stretches long enough for you to start hoping, and then she said, "Honey, we really don't have the space right now." And I blinked because I knew exactly how much space they had. A 4-bedroom house, 2 empty rooms most of the year. And I said, "I don't need much, Lily. And I can share a room," trying to keep my voice calm, trying not to sound desperate, even though I absolutely was. And she cut me off with, "Kyle and Brena are staying with us right now. You know how it is." And that part actually made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. My older brother Kyle, 33 years old, fully employed with a wife who also worked, staying comfortably in my parents' house, while I was trying to avoid homelessness with a 6-year-old, and I said, "Okay. Can Lily at least stay with you for a bit? Just until I find something." And her tone shifted slightly, a little firmer. Now, that wouldn't be fair to Kyle's kids. Serena and I had to stop myself from asking what part of any of this was fair, because I already knew how that would go. So I swallowed it and said, "Right, okay," like I always did, like I'd been trained to do my whole life. "Agree, don't push, don't make it uncomfortable." And she added, "You should look into assistance programs. There are resources for situations like this," as if I hadn't already thought of that, as if I wasn't already planning on doing exactly that. And I said, "Yeah, I will." Even though what I wanted to say was that I didn't call her for a brochure, I called her because she was my mother, but I didn't say that. I just thanked her for her time and hung up, and I sat there for a minute staring at my phone, feeling that familiar mix of disappointment and something heavier. Something older like this wasn't just about the apartment. This was about a pattern I had spent years pretending not to see. And after a few minutes, I picked up my phone again and texted Kyle, because maybe, just maybe, he'd come through where she didn't, so I kept it simple. "Hey, I'm in a tough spot. I need help with a deposit for a new place I can pay. To you back within 6 months." And I stared at the message before hitting send, knowing he'd see it, knowing he'd read it. And then I waited and waited. And of course, he didn't respond that night or the next morning. And when he finally did, it was short. Like he had already decided before even reading it. "Sorry, sis, we're tight right now. Mom said you should apply for Section 8. And I read it twice, just to make sure I wasn't missing something. Some hidden joke or sarcasm that would make it less insulting. But no, that was it, tight right now. And I almost admired how easily that word came out of people who clearly weren't tight at all. Because 10 minutes later, I opened Instagram, and there it was. Kyle standing next to a brand new silver Chevy Tahoe, big smile, keys in hand, captioned, upgraded number blessed, and I just stared at it. Not even angry at first, just confused, like, how do you go from we're tight to a brand new SUV in the same week? And then the anger came slow and steady because it wasn't just about the car. It was about the message. There was always money for Kyle, always room for Kyle, always understanding for Kyle. And for me, it was always figure it out. And suddenly, all these moments I had brushed off over the years started lining up in my head like they had been waiting for me to finally pay attention. Kyle getting a car at 18 while I was told to get a job. Kyle getting help with college with rent with his divorce lawyer, all framed as support, as family sticking together, and me being told to be responsible, to be independent, to not rely on anyone. And I realized it wasn't that my parents couldn't help me, it was that they chose not to, and that hit harder than the eviction notice. Because at least the eviction wasn't personal, this was. And I sat there holding my phone looking at that message, and for the first time, I didn't feel like asking again. I didn't feel like explaining myself better, or making my situation sound more urgent. Because if I might lose my home with your niece wasn't enough, then nothing I said was going to change that. And I added his text and the screenshot of that Tahoe to a folder on my phone without really thinking about why. Just this instinct to keep a record, to not let this disappear into another moment. I'd pretend didn't matter, and then I put my phone down, took a deep breath, and went back to the living room where Lily was sitting on the floor, drawing another house bigger than the last one, with a yard and a tree and a swing, and she looked up at me and said, "Do you like this one, Mom?" And I forced a smile and said, "Yeah, baby, that's a good one," because she deserved someone who said yes, even when everyone else said no. I zipped up the second suitcase, looked around the apartment one last time, and realized there was nothing left to decide. So 3 days later, Lily and I checked into the Maplewood family shelter with 2 bags of stuffed bear named Captain and exactly 0 dignity left to protect. And the first thing I noticed walking in was the smell. Not terrible, just a mix of industrial cleaner and whatever people had cooked earlier. The kind of smell that tells you a lot of different lives are happening in the same place at the same time. And the second thing I noticed was how loud quiet can be: doors closing, footsteps in the hallway, someone coughing behind a wall that wasn't really a wall, just a thin divider pretending to be one. The intake worker handed me a sheet of rules: curfew times, meal hours, shared bathroom expectations, and I nodded like I was reading it, even though I was really just trying to stay steady, because Lily was standing next to me looking around like we had just walked into some kind of weird hotel, and she asked, "Is this where we're staying?" And I said, "Just for a little while, because that's what you say when you don't have a better answer." Our room was small, 2 metal bunk beds, vinyl mattresses that made noise every time you moved one narrow window, and a light in the hallway that buzzed constantly like it had something to prove. Lily climbed up to the top bunk immediately and said it felt like a treehouse, which I appreciated because I needed one of us to think this was fun. And that first night I lay on the bottom bunk staring at the slats above me, listening to her shift around, hearing the hallway hum, someone talking quietly down the corridor, and I didn't sleep, not really, I just waited for morning. Because morning meant I could move, and moving felt better than thinking. Our routine started fast after that 5:30 alarm, quiet enough not to wake the people in the next room, shower in a shared bathroom with no locks, flip-flops on, tiles. I didn't want to think about keeping my toiletries in my bag, because anything left behind had a way of disappearing. Then I'd get Lily dressed, braid her hair with a comb I kept in my purse, and we'd head out before the hallway got crowded. I'd drop her at the before-school program by 715 drive to Maplewood Elementary, teach all day like nothing was wrong, like I hadn't slept in a room where the lights never really went off, like I wasn't calculating every dollar in my head between lessons. And then I'd pick her up at 4. Bring her back to the shelter, check in before curfew, and start the evening. Again, dinner was whatever was available or whatever I could bring in, usually something simple, something cheap. Lily didn't complain, she never complained, which somehow made it worse, because kids are supposed to complain. They're supposed to say something doesn't feel right, but she adapted. She always adapted. She'd sit at the common table with a box of donated crayons, most of them broken, all of them different, shades of not quite right. And she would draw constantly, pages and pages of drawings, flowers, animals, but mostly houses. Always houses, big ones, small ones, ones with fences, ones with trees. And I'd sit across from her pretending to check emails or grade papers while actually watching her create these places we didn't have. And every time she added a window or a door or a chimney, something inside me tightened just a little more. One night she looked up at me and said, "When and we go home, can I have a room with a window like this?" And I said, "Yeah, of course," because what else was I going to say? "No, baby, this is it. This is what we have now." And later that night when she fell asleep, I sat on the edge of the bunk with a notepad and did the math again. Same numbers, same gap, still impossible. And I remember thinking, this can't be it. This can't be where we get stuck, but every day started to look the same. Same hallway, same noise, same routine, same effort to make it feel temporary when it started to feel permanent. And Lily would ask small questions, not dramatic ones, just quiet ones like, why do we have to share a bathroom? Or why does the light make that sound? And I'd answer them the best I could without saying the real thing, which was that I had run out of options, that I had done everything right, and still ended up here. And the hardest part wasn't the discomfort. It wasn't the lack of privacy, or the noise, or even the dark uncertainty. It was knowing she was watching me, learning from me, and I kept wondering what she was taking in, whether this would be a story she told someday or a feeling she never quite shook. And one night, as I was tucking her in, she leaned over the side of the bunk and whispered, "Mom, this place is a little scary." And I said, "I know, but I right here," and she nodded. Like that was enough, like my being there fixed it. And I lay back down on that bottom bunk, listening to the same humming light, thinking she believes I can fix this. And for the first time since we arrived, that thought didn't feel comforting. It felt like pressure because I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep pretending everything was under control. I was halfway through pretending to grade papers at one of those plastic tables when I heard a car door shut outside, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a shelter parking lot. So I looked up through the window and saw a black sedan, clean, quiet, the kind of car that looks like it has a schedule and sticks to it. And then I saw her step out, and for a second my brain didn't catch up with my eyes because I hadn't seen my grandmother in almost 2 years. And in my head she was still somewhere in California, retired, distant, out of reach. But there she was, right outside the Maplewood family shelter, adjusting her coat, looking around like she was confirming an address she didn't quite believe. And I froze, like if I didn't move this wouldn't be real. But then she walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped inside, and her eyes moved across the room, scanning sharp, focused the same way I remembered until they landed on me. And she stopped just for a second, like she needed to process what she was seeing, and then she walked straight toward me without hesitation. And Lily looked up from her drawing and said, "Hi," like this was just another adult walking into the room. Like nothing about this moment was unusual. And my grandmother sat down across from me, took my hands and said my name in a way that made it sound like a question and an answer at the same time. Serena. And I said, "Grandma," because I didn't have anything else. And she looked at me, then passed me toward the open door of our room where the bunk bed was visible, then back at me, and she asked, "Why aren't you living in your house on Birchwood Lane?" And I actually thought I misheard her, like maybe she said something else, something that made more sense. So I said, "What house?" And she blinked, not confused, more like surprised, like I had just told her I didn't know my own name. and she reached into her handbag, pulled out her phone, tapped a few times, and turned the screen toward me, and I saw my name, my full name, printed clearly on a document. I saw an address I had never seen before, and words I only half understood in that moment. Irrevocable trust. Beneficiary. My name again, and a date from 2 years ago, and my brain started trying to catch up, trying to connect this to anything that made sense, but there was nothing. No memory, no conversation, nothing. And I said, I don't understand. And she leaned back slightly, studying my face, like she was looking for something, a reaction that would confirm. This was a misunderstanding, but she didn't find it, and she said slower this time, like she was choosing each word carefully. After your grandfather passed, I set aside a few properties. One of them was a 3-bedroom house on Birchwood Lane. I put it in a trust. You're the beneficiary, Serena. That house is yours. And I just stared at her, because there was no version of reality where that sentence fit into my life, and she kept going. I gave the documents to your mother. I trusted her to handle the details. She told me you moved in last April. She said you and Lily loved it. And I felt something shift inside me, not fully understanding yet, but enough to know this was wrong, deeply wrong, and I said, I've never been there. I didn't know it existed until right now, and she went very still. The kind of still that comes right before something breaks, and she asked, You've never been inside that house? And I shook my head, and she nodded once, slowly, like she was filing that away, and then she said, Then who has been living in it? And we both knew the answer without saying it. But neither of us said it out loud. Not yet. Because saying it would make it real. And she pulled up another screen on her phone, messages from my mother. Dates, photos, updates. Serena loves the house. Lily's room is painted yellow. Thank you so much, all sent to my grandmother over the past 2 years, building a version of my life that didn't exist. And she showed me a photo. A bright kitchen with blue curtains and a bowl of fruit on the counter. And she said, Do you recognize this? And I didn't, because I had never been there, and later I would find out it wasn't even a real photo of the house, just something pulled from the internet and passed off as mine. But in that moment, all I could think was that my mother had been telling this story, this detailed, consistent story for 2 years, while I was struggling to pay rent, while I was doing math on grocery receipts, while I was sleeping in a shelter. And my grandmother had believed every word of it, because why wouldn't she? It came from her daughter, and I felt this strange mix of anger and disbelief and something else, something sharper, like clarity. Because suddenly all those conversations with my mom, all those times she said no, all those excuses about not having space or money, they didn't just feel unfair anymore, they felt intentional, like there was a reason behind them that I hadn't seen until now. And my grandmother looked at me and said, We're going to figure this out. And her voice had changed. It wasn't confused anymore. It was steady, precise. The voice of someone who had just realized they'd been lied to and was already thinking 3 steps ahead. And I nodded because, for the first time, in weeks, maybe months, something made sense, not in a good way, but in a way that gave me direction. And as I sat there in that shelter across from the woman who had unknowingly given me a house I never received, I realized this wasn't just a misunderstanding, this wasn't a mistake, this was something much bigger, and whatever it was, it had just started to come apart. I stepped outside into the cold air, pulled my phone out and hit record before I dialed my mom, because at that point I didn't trust anything to stay where it happened, unless I kept it, and when she picked up, her voice sounded normal, calm, like she had no idea the ground had just shifted under me, and I said, I saw Grandma today, and there was a pause, not long, but just enough, and then she said, That's not possible, she's in California. And that was the moment everything snapped into place, not emotionally, just logically, like a puzzle finally locking together in the worst way. And I said, She's not, she's here. She came to the shelter, she showed me the trust. Documents for a house on Birchwood Lane with my name on it, and I listened. really listened, because this was where people usually stumble if they're caught off guard. But she didn't stumble, she didn't hesitate, she didn't even sound surprised. She went straight to control. "Serena, you need to calm down. Your grandmother is confused. She's been having memory issues," and I almost laughed because I had just spent an hour with a woman who could recall dates, addresses, and legal terms better than most people half her age. And I said, "She knew exactly what she was talking about, Mom, who is living in that house," and she didn't answer that question. Not directly. She shifted again. "You're under a lot of stress right now. You're not thinking clearly." And that's when I realized this wasn't new for her. This wasn't a lie she was making up in the moment. This was a script, something she had been using, refining, repeating, and I could almost hear how practiced it was, how easily it came out. And I said, "Why did you tell her I was living there?" And she said, "Because you were supposed to be Serena, but you make things difficult. You always have." And that one landed because it wasn't just a lie. It was a rewrite, a way to make this my fault, like I had somehow chosen not to live in a house I didn't even know existed. And I pressed. "You sent her pictures, updates, you told her Lily had a room there. None of that is real." And she cut in sharper. "Now I did what I had to do. Your grandmother doesn't handle stress well." I didn't want to upset her. And I stood there in the parking lot thinking about that, about how she had decided that protecting her own story was more important than telling the truth. And I said, "So you just made up a life for me?" And she didn't deny it. She didn't even try, she said. "It wasn't made up. It was what should have happened if you had been more responsible." And that was the line that stayed with me. Not because it was the worst thing she said, but because it explained everything. This wasn't just about hiding something. It was about control, about shaping reality to fit the version of me she had already decided was true, the unreliable one, the difficult one, the one who needed to be managed. And I thought about all the details my grandmother had shown me, the messages, the photos, the updates spaced out just enough to look natural, just enough to build a consistent story. And it hit me how deliberate it all was. This wasn't one lie. It was a system, a timeline, a fully built narrative that had been running in parallel to my actual life for 2 years. And I asked, "Did you tell her you changed your number?" And she said, "I gave her what she needed," which was another non-answer that told me everything. Because my grandmother had said she only gave her new ace to number to my mom. And suddenly it made sense why we hadn't heard from her, why birthdays came and went with cards sent to the wrong place, why every connection had been filtered through one person who controlled what got through and what didn't. And I said, "You told me she didn't want contact, that she needed space." And my mom replied, "That's what she said." And I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me, because now I could see how easy it was to isolate someone when you control the information. How simple it was to cut off a relationship without anyone realizing it was happening. And I thought about those 2 years, about how many times I could have reached out if I had known how different everything might have been. And instead, I was standing in a shelter parking lot while a house with my name on it was being used to fund someone else's life. And I said, "You let me think I had nothing." And she said, almost impatient now, "You did have nothing, Serena, because you don't know how to manage what you're given." And that was it. No apology, no hesitation, just a clear statement of belief. Like she genuinely thought this was justified. And I realized in that moment that she wasn't scared of being caught. She was confident she could explain it away, that she could reframe it, that she could make me look unstable if I pushed too hard. And right on cue, she added, "You need to be careful with how you're acting right now. Courts don't look kindly on mothers who can't provide stability." And there it was, the threat. Not loud, not obvious, but clear enough. a reminder of the guardianship. She still had some influence over a way to keep me in line, and I stood there for a second, letting that settle, not reacting, not arguing, just taking it in. And then I said, "I'm not confused, Mom, and I'm not unstable." And she didn't respond to that. She just said, "We'll talk about this later when you've calmed down," like she was closing a conversation. She thought she still controlled. And I said, "No, we won't." And I hung up, stopped the recording, and looked at my phone. And for the first time since all of this started, I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt focused, because the story she had been telling was starting to fall apart, and now I knew exactly where to start pulling. I sat across from Gerald at my grandmother's dining table and forced myself to stay calm while he opened the folder, because this was the part where things stopped being confusing and started being documented. And he didn't waste time. He said, "I pulled the county records this morning and slid the Proshin first page toward me. And there it was, the address. 1847 Birchwood Lane, listed under a trust with my name as beneficiary, exactly like my grandmother said." But then he pointed to another document attached to it, a lease agreement filed with the county, and I leaned in and saw a signature on the line, marked Landlord Authorization S. Mitchell, and for a second my brain tried to accept it because it looked close enough. The letters were shaped like mine, but then I looked harder and realized it wasn't my handwriting. The curves were off, the spacing was wrong, it was imitation, not a match, and Gerald said it plainly. "That's not your signature." And I shook my head because I knew every version of my name I had ever written, and that wasn't one of them. And he nodded like he expected that answer, then flipped to the next page, a spreadsheet he had, put together columns, dates, amounts, nothing emotional, just numbers. Monthly rent collected, he said $2,200 per month, duration, 24 months, and I did the math in my head before he finished, but he said it anyway. Total $52,800, and I just stared at the number because it wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't just a lie or a story. It was money, real money. Money that had been collected every single month while I was struggling to cover basic expenses, and he tapped another column, deposited into a joint account held by Diane and Robert Mitchell. My parents, not a trust account, not anything connected to me, just their personal account. And I asked. None of that came to me, even though I already knew the answer. And he said, "None." And I leaned back in the chair and let that sit for a second. $52,800. That was more than a year of my salary. That was every late night I spent worrying about bills, every time I said no to something Lily needed, because I couldn't make the numbers work, and it had all been sitting in their account the entire time. And before I could even process that fully, Gerald said, "There's more." And I looked back at him because, of course, there was. And he slid another document across the table, this one from a bank, and said, "A home equity line of credit was opened on the property about 14 months ago." And I felt that same disconnect again, like I was hearing something about someone else's life, and I said, "In my name?" And he nodded, "Yes, using your name, your social security number, and what appears to be another forged signature." And I looked at the application, my name typed neatly. My supposed occupation listed as property manager, which I wasn't, and the address listed as Birchwood Lane, where I had never lived, and I said, "How much?" And he didn't hesitate, $35,000 approved, and most of it has already been drawn. And I closed my eyes for a second, because now the number in my head was getting bigger, heavier, harder to ignore, and when I opened them, he was already turning to the next page. Bank statements highlighted transactions $12,000 to a contractor. He said, "Appears to be a home renovation," and I didn't even need to ask whose house I had seen. The pictures my mom posted last summer, new kitchen, new cabinets, finally got my dream kitchen, and I felt something in my chest tighten because that kitchen had a price tag. And now I knew where it came from. And he continued, $8,000 to a Visa account, likely credit card debt, then $5,000 to a Ford dealership. And I thought about the photo she accidentally sent, my dad holding keys to a new truck, smiling like it was a reward for something. And then Gerald paused for a second before saying, and $10,000 transferred to an account belonging to Kyle Mitchell, and that one didn't. Surprise me, not really. It just confirmed what I already knew, that the same month he told me he was tight, he was actually receiving money that came from a loan taken out in my name. And Gerald looked at me and said, total amount misappropriated, including rent and credit line, draws approximately $87,800. And there it was, the full number, not rounded, not estimated, real, documented, and I repeated it under my breath, 87,800, because saying it out loud made it harder to ignore. And I thought about everything that number represented, not just money, but time, stability, security, things that had been taken without me even knowing they existed. And I asked, this is fraud, right? Even though I already knew. And Gerald said forgery, fraud, identity theft, theft by deception, multiple counts depending on how it's filed, like he was listing items on a menu.com, precise, because to him this was a case, and to me this was my life being explained in numbers. And I looked at my grandmother, who hadn't said anything this entire time, just listening, absorbing, and her expression wasn't shocked anymore, it was settled. Like she had already moved past disbelief and into decision. And I realized this wasn't something that could be explained away or misunderstood. This was structured, repeated, intentional behavior over 2 years involving legal documents, financial accounts, and deliberate actions to benefit from something that was never theirs to use. And as I sat there looking at those pages at my name, printed on documents I had never signed tied to money, I had never seen, I understood something clearly. For the first time, this wasn't just a family problem, this was a legal one, and it was big enough that ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. I went back to the shelter that night, sat on the edge of the bunk, and turned everything into a system, because that's what I know how to do when things stop making sense. I organize them until they do so. I bought a 3-ring binder from a dollar store. On the way back, nothing fancy, just blue, plastic, and a pack of tab dividers. And I started building a case instead of a story first section. The trust, I added the certified copy. My grandmother gave me every page, stamped, notarized, my name printed clearly as beneficiary. Second section, property records, county filings showing the address, the lease, the credit line, all tied back to that same property. Third section, the lease agreement itself. I printed it and circled the signature that wasn't mine because I wanted that difference to be obvious. Not just something I claimed. Fourth section, screenshots. I went through my phone and pulled every message that mattered. My mom telling me to stop being dramatic, telling me to be more responsible. My brother saying he was tight, all time-stamped, all in order, and I printed them at the library 4 to a page to save money. Then I added the screenshot of his Tahoe post because context matters. Fifth section, audio. I transferred the recording of my call with my mom to a USB drive, labeled it with the date and time, because I didn't want anyone questioning when it was made or what it captured. And I wrote a short note summarizing the key points so it could be understood without even playing it. Sixth section, my journal, every entry I had been writing since the shelter dates, times what was said, who was present, especially my mom's visit and her comments about guardianship, because that wasn't just personal. That was leverage she had tried to use, and I made sure each entry was clean, factual, no extra emotion, just what happened. Because facts hold up better than feelings when someone tries to tear them apart. And then I added 2 more pieces. Gerald suggested the reverse image search results, showing the kitchen photo my mom sent my grandmother was pulled from a staging website, not a real picture of any house we had lived in, and an affidavit from Priya, my case manager, confirming that Lily and I had been living at the shelter since January, that I was consistent, cooperative, and that my daughter was safe and cared for. And I put that near the front because it addressed the one thing I knew my mom would try to use against me: stability. And I sat there flipping through the binder page by page, checking it like I would check lesson plans before a class, making sure everything had a place, everything had a purpose, and nothing was missing. Because if I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. No gaps, no assumptions, no loose ends. And the more I worked through it, the less overwhelmed I felt. Because this wasn't chaos anymore. This was structure. This was evidence. And evidence doesn't argue. It doesn't raise its voice. It just sits there and holds its ground. And over the next few days, I met with Gerald again, went over timelines, clarified details, made sure every document connected cleanly to the next. No contradictions, no confusion. Just a clear line from the trust to the lease to the bank records to the accounts, and he explained how this would play out, what would be filed, what would be presented, what we could expect in terms of response. And I listened, asked questions when I needed to, but mostly I focused on understanding, because I didn't want to be led through this. I wanted to know exactly what was happening at every step, and at night I'd go back to the shelter, sit at that same bunk and review everything again, not because I didn't trust it, but because I wanted to be ready. Ready to answer questions, ready to stay calm, ready to not get pulled into anything that would distract from the facts. And Lily would be on the top bunk drawing, same as always, asking me what color to use for the roof or the door, and I'd answer her while flipping through pages of documents that represented a version of our life that should have existed but didn't. And I kept thinking, this is the part where things change, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, methodically, like setting pieces in place before a move. And I noticed something else too. I wasn't asking for help anymore. I wasn't waiting for someone to step in or fix it. I was building something that didn't depend on anyone else's version of the story, and that felt different, not easier, but clearer, like I finally had direction. And one night after I finished organizing everything, I closed the binder, set it next to me, and just sat there for a minute listening to the same hallway noise. The same hum of that light, but it didn't feel the same anymore because this time I wasn't stuck in it. I was moving through it, and for the first time since all of this started, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. I parked outside my parents' house, looked at the lights on inside, and sat there for a few seconds with my hands on the steering wheel, because I knew once I walked in there was no going back to quiet. And then I grabbed the binder, got out of the car, and walked up to the front door like I belonged there, because technically I did. And the moment I stepped inside, I could feel it, that shift in the room when people recognize you as the topic of conversation. They were just having conversations stopped mid-sentence, a few smiles that didn't quite land, a couple of people avoiding eye contact entirely, and the house looked exactly like it always did for events. Decorations set just right, food laid out like a magazine spread, my mom's signature lemon cake sitting in the center. Like it was part of her brand, and I could already tell they had been briefed. The look said it, the quiet said it. They knew something about me, just not the truth. And then my mom came out of the kitchen, perfectly put together, hair done, outfit, pressed, smile ready, and for half a second it slipped when she saw me, just enough to catch it, and then it was back, warm, controlled. "Serena, I'm so glad you came," she said, as she walked toward me and hugged me like this was a normal night, like nothing had happened. And I didn't hug her back, I just stood there and let it happen, and she leaned in and whispered, "Don't make a scene." Like I was the one who needed managing, and I said I wouldn't dream of it, and stepped back, and before she could redirect the room, the doorbell rang and my dad opened it, and there she was, my grandmother standing on the porch like she had every right to be there because she did. And when she walked in, the energy changed instantly. People straightened up, voices lifted, real smiles this time, because she was respected in a way my mom pretended to be. And I watched my mom's face go pale, not confused, not surprised, just caught, and my grandmother greeted everyone, calm, polite, and then sat down like she had nowhere else to be, and after a minute she said casually, like she was asking about the weather, "Has anyone been to Serena's house on Birchwood Lane?" And the room went quiet, not dramatic quiet, just confused, uncertain, like people were waiting for someone else to explain what they just heard. And my mom moved quickly. "Mom, let's not get into that right now," but it was too late. The question was already in the air, and my grandmother looked at me and said, "Serena, have you been enjoying it?" And that was my moment, and I stood up, felt every eye in the room shift toward me. And I said, "I've never been inside that house. And you?" I could feel the confusion turn into something else, something sharper. And my mom stepped in. She's under a lot of stress. She doesn't know what she's saying. And I didn't look at her. I looked at everyone else and said, "Lily and I have been living in a shelter for the past 2 months, and that landed exactly the way it should. Silence, real silence, the kind where people don't know where to look." And I kept going, steady, clear. While the house my grandmother bought for me has been rented out for 2 years by my parents, and my dad stood up, voice raised, "That's enough." And I said, "No, it's not," and pulled the envelope out of my bag and set it on the table. "This is a formal demand letter prepared by an attorney," and I opened the binder, flipped to the first section. "This is the trust deed, my name, my property. Next tab, this is the lease. Agreement with a forged signature next. These are the bank records showing $52, 800 inches rent collected," and I could see people leaning in, trying to read, trying to understand. Next tab. "This is the home equity line of credit taken out in my name, $35,000, and I said the total out loud, $87,800, because numbers make things real, in a way words don't. And my mom tried again, louder. Now she's lying. She's twisting things. And my grandmother spoke for the first time since sitting down. "I wish she were," and that shut the room down completely, and I reached into my bag one more time and pulled out the court order. "This is the termination of the supplemental guardianship," and I held it up. "Effective immediately, full custody restored to me," and that was the part that hit her, not the money, not the documents, the control she thought she still had. And she said, "You can't do this." And I looked at her and said, "I already did." And then I stepped back and let the room react, and it did, not loudly, not with shouting, but with distance, people moving away from her, conversations starting without her, eyes that wouldn't meet hers anymore. My uncle saying, "Diane, is this true?" My cousin asking my brother if he knew, and him not having a good answer, just standing there with the same look I had seen on his face when he got caught doing something he thought he could get away with. And my mom started crying, the kind that looks for sympathy, but there wasn't any, not this time, because the story she had been telling for years had just been replaced with one that had proof, and proof doesn't care how you feel about it, and I didn't stay to watch it fall apart completely. I had said what I needed to say. I had put everything on the table, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to explain myself to anyone in that room. I drove away from that house, called Gerald from the car, and told him to move forward with everything we had discussed. No hesitation, no second guessing, and by Monday morning, the paperwork was already in motion. Civil suit filed in Multnomah, County Circuit Court listing fraud, forgery, identity theft, and breach of fiduciary duty, all tied directly to the property on Birchwood Lane, and at the same time, A formal complaint was submitted to the district attorney's office, which meant this wasn't just a private dispute anymore. It was on record, documented, and moving through a system that doesn't care about family dynamics or excuses, only evidence. And Gerald kept me updated in plain terms, no legal fluff, just facts. They've been served, the bank has been notified, the credit line is under investigation, and within 48 hours the bank froze the home equity line of credit because the application showed clear signs of fraud, which meant my parents suddenly had a very real problem that couldn't be talked away over dinner or explained with a story, and the tenants in the house were formally notified as well, not because they did anything wrong, but because they had been renting from someone who didn't have the legal right to rent the property. And Gerald handled that carefully, gave them time, returned their deposit out of pocket through my grandmother's account to avoid dragging them into something they didn't create. And I appreciated that because not everyone involved in this needed to be punished, just the people who actually made the decisions. And over the next couple of weeks, everything tightened. Their attorney reached out, tried to frame it as a misunderstanding at first, then shifted quickly when it became clear. We had documentation for every claim, emails, bank statements, recorded calls, certified documents. There wasn't any space left to argue facts, so the tone changed, less defensive, more strategic. And that's when the word settlement came up, and Gerald called me to walk through it line by line, so I understood exactly what was being offered and what it meant. Restitution of the full $52 800 inches rent, structured over 36 months. Automatic payments into a trust-managed account, so I didn't have to chase anything. The $35,000 credit line to be paid off directly to the bank within 90 days, or it would trigger additional legal action from the bank itself, not just from us, and then the $10,000 transferred to my brother to be repaid separately, because even if he didn't initiate it, he benefited from it. And that mattered. And on the criminal side, the district attorney agreed to reduce the charge from a felony to a misdemeanor under the condition that every payment was made on time and no violations occurred during a 3-year probation period, which meant one missed payment could bring the felony charge back. And there was a no-contact order, included clear, direct, no phone calls, no messages, no showing up unannounced, nothing unless it went through legal channels. And Gerald asked me if I wanted to accept those terms or push further, and I sat there for a minute thinking about it, not emotionally, just practically what outcome actually mattered. And the answer was simple. I wanted my house secured, wanted the money returned, and I wanted this documented in a way that couldn't be rewritten later, and the settlement did all of that, so I said yes. And once that was agreed on, things moved quickly. My dad sold the truck he had bought with part of the credit line money. My mom lost her job after the charges became public record, not because of the case itself, but because of what it represented, and the payments started on Schedule 1st. Deposit exactly when it was supposed to be. No delays, no excuses, and I didn't celebrate that. I just checked it once, confirmed it was there, and moved on, because at that point it wasn't about winning. It was about closing the gap between what happened and what needed to be corrected. And by the end of the process, the property was fully transferred under my control through the trust. The legal authority was clear, the financial obligations were defined, and the people who created the situation were now accountable for fixing it over time. And the most important part for me wasn't even the money. It was the fact that everything was now documented in a system that didn't rely on anyone's version of the story. It relied on records, filings, and enforceable agreements, which meant this wasn't something that could be twisted later into something it wasn't. And as all of that settled into place, the what is end of noise around it started to fade. Fewer calls, fewer updates, just a steady process moving forward the way it was supposed to. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was just watching it resolve exactly the way it should have from the beginning. I held the key in my hand for a second before I used it, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to remember that moment exactly as it was: simple, quiet, real. And then I turned, it opened the door, and stepped into a house that had technically been mine for 2 years but finally felt like it belonged to me. And the first thing I noticed wasn't how big it was or how nice it looked, it was how quiet it felt. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from people trying not to make noise, but from having space that's actually yours. And Lily walked in right behind me, stopped in the middle of the living room, and did a slow spin like she was taking inventory, like she didn't want to miss anything. And then she saw backyard through the glass door and said, "Mom, there's a swing," like she had just found something she had been drawing for months. And she ran outside without waiting for an answer. And I let her, because for once there was nothing to stop her. No rules about shared spaces, no curfews, no explaining why we couldn't do something, just a yard, a tree, and a swing that was already there waiting for her. And I stood in the doorway watching her for a minute before I walked through the house, room by room, not rushing, just noticing things. The kitchen, that was smaller than the fake photo my mom had sent, but real, in a way that mattered. The window over the sink, the light coming in. The built-in shelves in the small bedroom that was perfect for Lily and I. Set her drawing, the one she made at the shelter, with the house and the swing on that shelf, because it belonged there more than anything else we owned. And later, that day, we brought in the few things we had: a couple of suitcases, a bag of her art supplies, her stuffed bear, and it didn't look like much in that space, but it was enough because it was ours. And that night I put her to bed in her own room, for the first time in over 2 months. No hallway noise, no buzzing light, no strangers on the other side of a thin wall, just her, a real bed, and a door I could close. And I stood there for a minute after she fell asleep, listening, making sure it was as ride and quiet as it felt. And then I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and let everything catch up to me. Not the anger, not the frustration, just the release of finally not having to hold everything together at the same time. And over the next few weeks we built a routine that actually made sense. Mornings without rushing out of a shared space, evenings without checking a clock, for curfew weekends where Lily could sit at the kitchen table and draw, with all her pencils spread out, instead of digging through a bin of broken crayons. And my grandmother came by every Saturday, no announcements, no drama, just showing up with small things we needed: a kettle, a set of dishes, things that made the house feel lived in instead of just occupied. And Lily started calling her she, which stuck, and I'd watch them sit at the table drawing together, my grandmother trying and failing to stay inside the lines, Lily laughing at it. And for the first time in a long time, things felt normal, not perfect, just stable, and that was enough. And I started going to therapy because I needed to understand why I had accepted certain things for so long. Why, okay, mom had been my default response for years. And it wasn't about blaming anyone, it was about making sure I didn't carry that pattern forward, especially not with my daughter, because she was watching everything just like she always had. And one day she asked me, "Why didn't we always live here?" And I thought about it for a second, not rushing the answer, and I said, "Because sometimes it takes a while to figure out what's actually yours." And she nodded like that made sense, went back to her drawing, and I realized that was the part that mattered most. Not the legal case, not the money, but the fact she would grow up knowing that when something was wrong, you didn't just accept it to keep the peace, you fixed it, even if it was uncomfortable, even if it meant standing up to people you thought you couldn't stand up to. And I don't think my mom ever expected that. I think she thought I'd keep doing what I had always done, adjust, accept, move on, but at some point that stopped being an option, and I didn't do any of this to get back at her. I did because I had a daughter who deserved better than a story that didn't include her having a home. And now she has one, not because someone gave it to her, but because I made sure no one could take it away again. And if there's anything I would say to someone who's in a situation where they feel stuck or unsure or like speaking up will make things worse, it's this: silence doesn't protect you, it just makes it easier for things to stay exactly the way they are. And sometimes the only way forward is to say something, do something, and follow it all the way through, even when it gets uncomfortable, because on the other side of that is something real, something stable, something you don't have to question. And for me, that looks like a small house on Birchwood Lane, a kid at the kitchen table drawing a house that actually matches the one she's sitting in, and a life that finally lines up with the truth.